imagine, just for a second, that you are living in the year 33 AD.
Oh, wow. Okay, putting us right in it.
Yeah, exactly. You're standing in the dust and the heat of Judea. And, this is a really restless, deeply turbulent province on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire.
Right, a real powder keg.
Totally. But let's try to actually visualize this environment for a minute. The air smells like arid earth, livestock, and burning incense.
Yeah.
And beneath the murmur of thousands of voices gathered for these big seasonal festivals, there is this constant rhythmic sound.
And what's the sound?
It's the clinking of coins.
Oh, right.
Yeah, shekels, denarii, drachmae, just all exchanging hands, being weighed, being hoarded. Because, make no mistake, the Roman Empire isn't just a military superpower.
No, not at all.
Right, it is this sprawling bureaucratic engine that runs entirely on two very specific fuels, which are manpower and money.
Mainly money, yeah.
So, keeping that sensory landscape in mind, I want to pose a thought experiment to you, the listener. What if the foundational events of the modern era, like events that shaped global history, culture, and belief, what if they weren't driven simply by theological differences?
Okay.
What if, at their absolute core, they were driven by a desperate, high-stakes attempt to protect a massive, monopolistic financial enterprise?
Framing it as a financial defense strategy is startling, certainly, but it actually aligns perfectly with the data we are examining today.
Right.
We have this fascinating set of historical and economic texts in front of us, and they actively challenge us to look at the origins of the early church through this lens of just pure, unfiltered economics.
Oh, the money.
Exactly, yeah. It strips away the theological varnish and looks straight at the ledger.
And that's our mission for this deep dive today. We're going to unpack how the local ruling council in Judea essentially operated as a massive central bank.
Which is a wild concept.
It really is. And we'll explore how an early movement, the Nazarenes, presented an existential threat not just to a belief system, but to a bottom line.
Yeah.
And perhaps most surprisingly, we're going to look at textual evidence suggesting that historical records were strategically edited, retroactively scrubbed by one of history's most famous figures.
To hide what was essentially an economic war.
Exactly. But before we get into all that, we should probably set some ground rules.
Yeah, that's vital. Before we delve into the mechanical realities of that ancient economy, let's establish our analytical parameters.
Right, because this is sensitive stuff.
Highly sensitive. The texts we are examining touch on deeply foundational religious histories. They present theories that actively challenge narratives held as sacred for millennia.
Yeah?
So our goal today is absolutely not to endorse a specific viewpoint or take a theological side or demonize any historical figure.
We are just the messengers here.
Precisely. We are here strictly to impartially report and analyze the provocative ideas contained in these specific documents. We're treating this purely as an exploration of human economic incentives, power structures, and the nature of historical record-keeping.
Okay, with that out of the way, let's jump right into the machinery of the Roman Empire under Emperor Tiberius.
Let's do it.
Because to understand the local conflict in Judea, you really have to understand the global corporate boss. So what did the world look like under Tiberius?
Well, Tiberius inherited the throne from Emperor Augustus, right?
Yeah.
And Augustus had essentially established the blueprint for absolute global control.
He laid the groundwork.
Yeah, he left behind a legacy of pure military domination. So Tiberius inherits this stabilized, vast territory. But what we need to fundamentally understand about the Roman economy in the first century
is that it wasn't like ours.
No, not at all. It was not a mercantile economy in the way we think of one today. They didn't have massive industrial sectors manufacturing consumer goods to export and sell.
Right, so they weren't building iPhones and exporting cars.
Exactly. Their primary export was domination.
Wow, domination.
Yeah. They produced legions and they produced governors.
Mm-hmm.
Their entire macroeconomic model relied on extraction. The texts we are looking at refer to this business model as, quote, harvesting humanity.
Harvesting humanity. That is incredibly dark.
It is.
Yeah.
When a Roman legion conquered a territory, they didn't just plant a flag and say, well, we own this now.
Right.
They systematically exploited the agricultural output. They seized the mines, and they monetized the population through taxation and tribute.
They were just squeezing every penny out of them.
They were in the business of subjugating people and turning that subjugation into revenue. We're talking about an influx of wealth that, adjusted for inflation, equates to billions of dollars flowing back into the imperial capital.
Billions.
Yeah. Rome was this power vacuum that required a continuous, staggering influx of capital just to keep the infrastructure from collapsing under its own weight.
Okay, billions of dollars. That really puts the sheer scale of the pressure into perspective. So Rome is the apex predator extracting wealth globally.
Right.
Now let's zoom in on Judea. You've got this incredibly tense environment there. The Roman prefects, men like Pontius Pilate are stationed there.
Yes.
But what did a Roman prefect actually do on like a random Tuesday? What was his actual job?
Well, a Roman prefect was essentially a military governor. He commanded the localized garrisons. He held the power of the sword, which meant he was the ultimate authority on capital punishment for crimes against the state.
Okay.
But the Romans were highly pragmatic. They knew that micromanaging the daily lives, the obscure local laws, and the complex religious customs of every single province they conquered.
That would be a bureaucratic nightmare.
An absolute nightmare, yeah. So they utilized local proxy governments. And in Judea, that proxy was the Sanhedrin.
Okay, let's define the Sanhedrin, because they are really the central players here. They weren't just like a group of priests leading prayers, were they?
Far from it. The Sanhedrin was a supreme council, typically composed of 71 men. These were the absolute elite of Judean society.
1%.
Exactly. The aristocratic high priests, the Sadducees, the leading Pharisees, the tribal elders. Rome allowed the Sanhedrin to act as the judge, jury, and executioner for virtually all matters concerning local Jewish civil and religious law.
But there was a catch, right?
A massive catch. They had this power provided they met one non-negotiable condition.
Which was?
The tribute money to Rome could not be interrupted, and the region had to remain docile.
Don't mess with the money, don't start a riot.
Precisely.
And this brings us to the concept the texts call God Inc. And I want to really dig into the mechanics of this because the Sanhedrin didn't just, collect a standard income tax.
No.
They operated this localized economic monopoly centered entirely around the temple in Jerusalem.
Yes, they did.
So how did they actually extract this immense wealth from the population, like mechanically?
Well, the extraction mechanisms were brilliant, really, in their integration with daily life. For a Jewish person in the first century, the temple wasn't just a symbolic building.
Right.
It was the literal, physical epicenter of their relationship with the divine. To participate in religious life, to be absolved of certain sins, or to celebrate major festivals like Passover, you were required by religious law to offer sacrifices.
Okay, but you couldn't just, bring a sheep from your backyard, could you?
No, that's the trick. The animal had to be deemed, quote, unblemished by temple inspectors. And naturally, the animals sold directly within the temple courts by Sanhedrin-approved vendors.
Let me guess, those were pre-approved.
Yes, pre-approved, but sold at exorbitant markups.
So it's a captive market. You literally have to buy from them.
Exactly. Furthermore, there was an annual temple tax required of every adult Jewish male. But here is the critical mechanical detail on that. This tax could not be paid in standard Roman or Greek currency, because those coins often bore the image of an emperor, which violated the religious prohibition against graven images.
Oh, no, right, the commandments.
Right, so the tax had to be paid in a specific currency, typically the Tyrian shekel, which had a high silver content.
And let me guess again. The only place to exchange your Roman denarii for Tyrian shekels was at the temple.
Yes, at the tables of the money changers. And they charged massive premium exchange rates.
Of course they did.
So when you combine the marked up sacrificial animals, the currency exchange fees, the mandatory tithes, and the voluntary offerings, you have a relentless, massive river of capital flowing directly into the temple treasury.
Okay, so structurally, it's basically a massive franchise operation.
That's a good way to look at it.
Like the Sanhedrin are the regional franchise managers. They have this incredibly lucrative territory, but they are paying these massive mandatory protection fees to corporate, which is Rome, and to ensure they survive and to maintain their aristocratic, luxurious lifestyles, they ruthlessly overcharge the local customers. So the temple in Jerusalem isn't just a place of worship. In this economic model, it basically acts as the central bank of Judea.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
The temple treasury essentially functioned as the national reserve, and this wealth served a dual purpose.
What were they?
Well, first, it heavily lined the pockets of the high priests. Archaeological evidence confirms these elites lived in sprawling, luxurious mansions in the upper city of Jerusalem.
Right.
But crucially, the second purpose was that this wealth was the buffer that kept Rome at bay. The Sanhedrin used this capital to pay off the Roman prefects, effectively buying political autonomy.
Okay, but think about the psychological toll this takes on the average Judean. I mean, this isn't just any piece of real estate. This is the promised land.
Right, highly sacred ground.
Their ancestors fought, bled, and died for this soil. And now they're forced to share it with foreign occupiers, and their own religious leaders are bleeding them dry just to pay off those occupiers.
It created an immense underlying tension. The texts we are analyzing highlight a profound psychological reality about immense wealth. When an institution is dealing with millions, or in modern equivalents, billions of dollars of income, the necessity of maintaining that income stream eventually dictates the moral compass of the men who control it.
The money becomes the god.
Exactly. The Sanhedrin was trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle. Their survival, their political power, and their luxury depended entirely on ruthlessly defending that river of money.
Okay, so you have this ruthless, highly profitable monopoly that has thoroughly cornered the market on divine salvation.
Yes.
What happens to a monopoly like that when a competitor suddenly arrives on the scene offering the exact same vital service, but offering it completely for free?
Well, that is the exact flashpoint we are examining here. The competitor in this scenario is the movement initially known as the Sect of the Nazarenes, or the Way. And this movement was led by Jesus and, crucially, his brother James. To understand the threat they posed, we have to look closely at their core teachings, not just as theology, but as economic disruption.
Because the texts make a point to frame their teachings as reformed Jewish belief, right? They aren't throwing away the Torah. They are just, like, reading it differently.
Precisely. They were reading the exact same ancient scriptures, but they were stripping away the centuries of institutional bureaucracy that the Sanhedrin had built on top of it.
Getting back to basics.
Yeah, the core message of the Way was revolutionary in its simplicity. The path to God did not require a monetary toll.
No purchasing of unblemished doves, no exchanging coins at a premium, no paying for intermediary blessings from a priest.
Exactly. They taught that an individual could communicate directly with the divine. A pure relationship with God could be achieved through faith, repentance, and direct prayer.
So the institutional middleman is rendered entirely obsolete.
Completely obsolete.
Now, I want to pause here to clarify a massive theological nuance that the sources emphasize because it's vital for understanding the timeline of everything.
Sure.
According to the texts, how did the followers of the Way view Jesus at this exact moment in 33 AD? Because it differs from what develops centuries later, doesn't it?
It is a critical distinction, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The historical analysis suggests that at this specific juncture in 33 AD, the immediate followers of the Way viewed Jesus primarily as a man.
Okay.
He was seen as a profound leader, a divinely inspired rabbi, a prophet sent by God to absorb sin and act as a guiding light.
Right.
However, the texts argue that he was not yet claimed by this original localized sect to be the fullness of the Godhead, or like a literal manifestation of the Creator requiring worship in his own right.
He was a guide helping people find their own direct, free path to God.
Exactly.
So why does that distinction matter so much? Like, why focus on that?
Because it explains the nature of the Sanhedrin's panic. If Jesus was simply a localized rabbi claiming to offer a reformed, free path to God, the immediate threat wasn't necessarily a massive theological heresy that threatened to tear the fabric of Judaism apart.
Right, because heretical preachers popped up frequently in the first century, didn't they?
All the time. The threat was explicitly economic. The sources use a highly effective metaphor here. Think of the Sanhedrin's income as a massive, stable river.
Okay.
The teachings of the Nazarenes were boulders thrown directly into that river. They didn't stop the river entirely, but they began diverting the flow of the money away from the temple.
I want to look closely at that metaphor, because if you throw enough boulders into a river, the water finds a new path.
Yes, it does.
If thousands of people in Judea start believing they can achieve salvation in their own homes, in their own fields, without traveling to Jerusalem and paying the temple tax, the revenue drops.
Drastically.
So you are saying this wasn't viewed by the high priest as a spiritual crisis, but as a catastrophic drop in quarterly earnings.
The economic analysis insists on this reality, yeah. Changing the path of salvation meant changing the path of the money.
Wow.
A belief system that democratizes access to God inherently demonetizes the institution that previously controlled that access. The Nazarenes were bypassing the toll booth.
Bypassing the toll booth. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of Caiaphas or the high-ranking members of the Sanhedrin, the panic isn't about doctrine, is it?
No.
It's about survival. because if the populace stops paying for temple rituals, the central bank dries up.
Right.
And if the central bank dries up, what happens to the Roman tribute?
The tribute fails. And Rome's patience with proxy governments was entirely contingent on the tribute arriving on time.
Right.
If the Sanhedrin failed to deliver the funds, the Roman prefect would inevitably intervene. And Roman intervention did not involve audits.
What did it involve?
It involved legions, steel, and mass casualties.
Oh,
Yeah, the Sanhedrin would lose their power, their wealth, and likely their lives. Therefore, the Nazarenes weren't just annoying competitors preaching out in the countryside.
right.
By threatening the revenue stream, they were threatening the political buffer that kept the Roman military machine from crushing Judea.
They were an existential threat to the entire social order.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if you threaten the bottom line of a billion-dollar empire, the empire is going to fight back.
Right.
But here is where the mechanical reality of first-century law creates a fascinating gridlock. Because the Sanhedrin couldn't just send the temple guards to publicly execute Jesus for hurting their prophets, could they?
No, they could not. And understanding the legal boundaries of 33 AD is essential here. The Sanhedrin had a specific jurisdiction.
Which was what?
Well, under traditional Jewish law, if a man was found guilty of severe religious blasphemy, such as claiming divine authority that contradicted the Torah, the prescribed punishment was stoning.
Stoning.
Yes. And the Sanhedrin possessed the authority to carry out stonings locally for religious infractions.
But they didn't stone Jesus.
Exactly. And the analysis argues there is a deeply strategic reason for this.
Let's hear it.
The Sanhedrin recognized that simply stoning a popular rabbi for a theological dispute might backfire. It could turn him into a localized religious martyr.
Right, which might enrage the populace and inadvertently draw more followers to his movement.
And further threaten the revenue. They needed a death that wasn't just physical. They needed it to be sociologically destructive. They needed absolute deterrence.
And Rome had the ultimate deterrent.
Yes, they did. But Rome, as we discussed, was busy managing a global empire. A Roman prefect like Pontius Pilate could not care less about a dispute over temple rituals or the semantics of localized salvation.
Right, they had bigger fish to fry.
Exactly. If the Sanhedrin brought a man to Pilate and said, hey, this man is telling people to pray for free and it's hurting our temple tax, Pilate would have laughed him out of the praetorium. Rome did not execute people for local religious infractions.
So the Sanhedrin needs access to Rome's execution methods, but they don't have a crime that Rome cares about.
Exactly.
So what do?
They execute a brilliant, ruthless legal maneuver. Led by highly educated strategic thinkers within the council. The texts specifically mention figures like the respected Rabbi Gamaliel the Sanhedrin orchestrated a massive political spin.
What kind of spin?
They took an internal dispute over religious economics and entirely reframed it as a direct political threat against Emperor Tiberius.
They framed him for treason.
Mechanically, yes. Under Roman law, the lex Julia majestatis, treason against the emperor, was the highest crime imaginable.
Okay.
By accusing Jesus of claiming to be the king of the Jews, the Sanhedrin shifted the narrative. They forced Pilate's hand.
How so?
They essentially told the Roman prefect, look, this man is not just a heretic, he is actively claiming political sovereignty. He is an insurrectionist challenging the authority of Caesar.
Oh, wow.
And if you, Pilate, do not execute him, you are no friend of Caesar.
Which is a terrifying threat to a mid-level Roman bureaucrat.
Absolutely terrifying.
Pilate has to act, or he looks weak on treason. And by forcing it into a Roman treason trial, the Sanhedrin unlocks access to crucifixion.
They do.
And let's talk about the reality of crucifixion, because we see it today as a religious symbol. But to a person in 33 AD, what did a cross actually represent?
It had absolutely zero religious connotation.
None.
The texts are emphatic on this point. Crucifixion was a highly specific, calculated political tool designed by Rome. It was the ultimate theater of terror.
The theater of terror.
Yeah. It was reserved almost exclusively for slaves, pirates, and rebels people who challenged the foundational stability of the state. It was designed to be as agonizing, as prolonged, and as publicly degrading as humanly possible.
So it wasn't just an execution, it was a billboard.
A visceral billboard. The Romans would place the victims along major roadways at eye level, leaving the bodies there for days. It was a psychological weapon designed to communicate one clear message to the populace.
Which is, do not disrupt the Roman order. So when we put all these pieces together, the magnitude of what the Sanhedrin accomplished is chilling.
It really is.
They effectively weaponized the Roman state military to protect their own bank accounts. By framing Jesus as a political rebel, they manipulated Rome into using its ultimate theater of terror to publicly decimate the leader of an economic rebellion.
Yes.
And it was designed to terrify anyone else in the Nazarene movement into total silence.
It was a masterclass in proxy enforcement. The religious hierarchy moved the execution entirely into the Roman political sphere.
Keeps their hands clean.
Exactly. This allowed the high priests to ostensibly keep their hands clean of the blood, avoiding the anger of the local crowds, while simultaneously securing the most permanent, horrifying elimination of their greatest financial liability.
I'm trying to think of a modern parallel to really cement this.
Sure.
It's like a massive legacy energy corporation realizing a small tech startup has invented a free, unlimited power source.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The corporation knows they can't legally just murder the startup CEO for inventing a better product. So they plant evidence, frame the CEO for domestic terrorism, and tip off the federal government.
Right.
The feds swoop in, freeze the assets, and lock the CEO away forever. The corporation keeps its monopoly, eliminates the threat, and the general public thinks the government just stopped a terrorist.
That is exactly it. The mechanics of the strategy are identical. However, the historical record indicates that the Sanhedrin's maneuver didn't solve the problem entirely.
It didn't.
No. Taking out the leader with Roman help was a massive blow. But the movement, the way survived. The boulders were still in the river.
Right.
People like James were still organized, still preaching direct access, and the capital was still bleeding. To truly crush a grassroots movement, God Inc. couldn't rely on Rome forever.
Because Rome doesn't care about the details.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They needed their own internal, localized enforcement mechanism.
Okay, so you've successfully framed the leader, the Romans have executed him, and you think your monopoly is safe. But the followers are still out there, quietly diverting the funds. You need an internal cleanup crew.
You do.
Who do you hire for that?
Enter Saul of Tarsus.
Saul of Tarsus. Now, for anyone who grew up in the church, that name triggers an immediate association. You think of St. Paul, the apostle, the man who wrote half the New Testament and built the theological foundation of global Christianity.
Naturally.
But we have to separate Paul the apostle from Saul the 20-something in 33 AD. Who was Saul, mechanically speaking, at this exact moment in history?
Well, in the year 33 A.D., Saul is a young man, likely in his late 20s. He is a highly educated, fiercely strict Pharisee.
Let's define what a Pharisee actually was, because it's not just a generic term for a religious person, is it?
Right. Correct. The Pharisees were a powerful social and religious sect within Judea. Unlike the Sadducees, who were the aristocratic priests actually running the temple, the Pharisees were the legal scholars, the Puritans, the absolute zealots for the meticulous observance of both the written Torah and the vast oral traditions.
Right.
They held immense sway over the common people.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, Saul was a direct protege of Rabbi Gamaliel.
Gamaliel, we mentioned him earlier.
Yes, as a leading, highly respected mind on the Sanhedrin Council. So Saul isn't just an angry zealot off the street. He has elite pedigree. He has institutional backing.
He's connected.
Very connected. His voice and actions carry the immense weight of the Judean high court behind them.
So he basically has a badge.
Essentially, yes.
But he isn't just sitting in a study debating scripture. The texts we are looking at describe his day-to-day operations in a much darker light.
The terminology the analysis employs to describe Saul's function is quite striking. They characterize him as a high-level cleaner, an inquisitor.
A cleaner, like in a mob movie.
Yes. The texts compare him to an enforcer executing a mob hit order, or liken him to the sheriff of Nottingham in the Judean forest.
Wow.
His explicit, mandated mission from his superiors in God Inc. was to hunt down, track, and decimate the surviving followers of the way.
How does that actually work on the ground, though? How does a religious scholar enforce mob hits without the Romans shutting him down?
Because Rome, as we noted, didn't care about internal religious disputes unless they threatened the peace or the taxes. The Sanhedrin had its own temple guards, its own localized authority to arrest and discipline Jewish citizens for religious infractions.
Okay.
Saul was granted letters of authority from the high priest. He could travel to different synagogues, demand the extradition of individuals associating with the Nazarene movement, and drag them back to Jerusalem for punishment.
Which meant what?
Which often included severe beatings, imprisonment, and, as we will see, execution.
Because, again, it all tracks back to the ledger. His job wasn't just to win theological arguments. His job was to plug the holes in the financial bucket. The order of the day was to root out anyone challenging the monetary income of the temple.
He was tasked with being the final nail in the proverbial coffin. If the Roman crucifixion severed the head of the movement, Saul was the localized enforcer dispatched to systematically crush the body.
That makes total sense economically.
And this economic reality fundamentally reframes several major events in early church history. Take, for instance, his infamous journey to Damascus.
The road to Damascus.
Right. Traditional narratives often present this as the zealous overreach of a man simply furious at a new theology. But the economic analysis suggests a much more calculated strategic motive. It views the Damascus journey as a targeted institutional hit order.
Why Damascus specifically, though?
Because the movement was spreading. The financial threat of the way was taking root in a new, wealthy urban center outside of Judea.
Ah, they were expanding the franchise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Sanhedrin couldn't allow the economic contagion to spread. Saul was formally dispatched by the leadership of God Inc. to travel to Damascus, root out the organizers, and aggressively protect the revenue stream before the local population stopped relying on the Jerusalem temple.
Okay, I have to step in and push back here. Not on the logic of the economics, which tracks perfectly, but on the timeline.
Sure, go ahead.
I am trying to reconcile this analysis with the standard historical narrative. You are telling me that Saul, before his conversion to Paul, was operating at the absolute highest levels of the Sanhedrin's enforcement wing in 33 AD.
Yes.
He is the lead inquisitor, hunting down this exact group of people in the exact city of Jerusalem. If he is their top enforcer, acting on behalf of the very men who just orchestrated the crucifixion of Jesus,
Right.
how is it possible that Saul is completely absent from every single historical account of Jesus' trial and execution?
That is the pivotal question. It is the exact historical discrepancy that the authors of these texts zero in on. They argue that this glaring omission is absolutely not an accident, a forgotten detail, or a coincidence. They posit that it is the deliberate cornerstone of one of the most successful, massive historical public relations campaigns ever executed.
You are saying it was a cover-up, like a retroactive edit of the history books.
The analysis calls it a clever cut-and-paste job.
Wow.
To understand why they argue this, we have to look intimately at the timeline of events in 33 AD.
Okay, lay it out for us.
According to the historical consensus, Jesus is executed via Roman crucifixion around the spring of 33 AD.
Right.
Only a matter of months later, perhaps less than a year, in that exact same controlled state of Judea, in that exact same city of Jerusalem, a prominent follower of the way named Stephen is executed.
And how is Stephen executed?
Stephen is stoned to death.
Which, as we established earlier, is the official, localized Jewish punishment for religious heresy, executed under the authority of the Sanhedrin.
Correct. Now, in the texts written decades later by Paul himself, he openly and freely admits to being present at Stephen's death.
He does.
Yes, he describes himself as holding the coats of the men, throwing the stones, essentially acting as the official witness, the jury, and the proxy executioner on behalf of the Sanhedrin. Furthermore, Paul's later writings categorize Stephen as the first Christian martyr.
Wait, hold on. The texts we are reviewing point out a massive linguistic anachronism here, right?
Yes, they do.
The word Christian didn't even exist in 33 AD.
It absolutely did not. The term Christian was coined decades later, roughly around 40 or 45 AD, in the city of Antioch, far north of Jerusalem.
So what were they called then?
In 33 AD, the people Stephen and Jesus associated with were known strictly as the sects of the Nazarenes, or the Way.
So why the word swap?
The sources argue that Paul, writing years later, went back into his own history and retroactively inserted the term Christian into the narrative of Stephen's death. It was a categorical edit to align the past with the brand he was building in the present.
Wow. Okay, let's lay the pieces on the table here. Saul admits to organizing the execution of Stephen, a prominent leader of the Way, mere months after Jesus dies.
Right.
But Jesus, the founder of the entire movement, is completely absent from Saul's extensive, self-admitted rap sheet.
Exactly.
The texts we are reading argue that it is mathematically, logistically, and logically impossible for a man of Saul's high-ranking status, operating as the chief inquisitor against this exact sect, in the exact same year, in the exact same geographic location, to have been unaware of or absent from the trial and execution of the group's founder.
It strains credulity beyond the breaking point.
It really does.
If Saul was the designated cleaner for the Sanhedrin, actively utilizing warrants from the high priest to hunt this specific group, He would have been intimately involved in the intelligence gathering, the arrest, the trial, or at the very least, physically present at the execution of Jesus.
He was the point man for the problem.
Exactly. So, the question demands an answer. Why is he scrubbed from those records? The economic and historical analysis offers a deeply pragmatic, multi-layered explanation for this strategic deflection of guilt.
Let's break down those layers. What is the immediate short-term reason for keeping Saul out of the Jesus narrative?
Well, the first reason relates directly back to the legal maneuver we discussed earlier. Remember, the Sanhedrin had to secure a Roman crucifixion.
Yes, the theater of terror.
Exactly. To do that, they had to convince Pontius Pilate that Jesus was a political traitor, an insurrectionist challenging the emperor.
Right.
Now imagine if Saul was leading that charge. Saul was a Pharisee. He was known publicly as a zealous, puritanical religious enforcer,
Yeah.
a man whose entire job was hunting down violations of Jewish theology. If the Romans saw the Sanhedrin's top religious hitman actively spearheading a trial that was supposedly about a political threat to Rome, it would have looked incredibly suspicious.
Oh, I see. Pilate might have seen right through the facade.
Exactly. He would have realized it was an internal religious dispute, and he might have thrown the case out.
That makes total strategic sense. You have to keep the religious inquisitor entirely out of the political frame job so the Romans don't catch on to the manipulation.
Precisely.
You keep Saul in the shadows so the trial looks like a secular concern. But the texts suggest a much larger, long-term motive for the scrub, don't they?
Yes, and this is where the narrative shifts from local politics to the trajectory of global history. The most vital reason for the omission was for the future survival and authority of the man himself.
Of Paul.
Right. Eventually, Saul experiences his profound pivot on the road to Damascus. He transitions from Saul the enforcer to Paul the apostle.
Okay.
He begins to travel, to write, and to build the foundation of an entirely new religious architecture. But as the analysis brilliantly points out, there is a fundamental law of human leadership.
Which is?
It is virtually impossible to convince the masses to follow you if they know you were the man who led the lamb to the lion.
Oh, man, it's the ultimate PR nightmare. You can't successfully rebrand yourself as the CEO of a movement if the historical record shows you assassinated the original founder.
You just can't. If Paul was going to successfully create, legitimize, and lead this new global brand, he had an absolute mandate to erase his role in the original founder's death.
Wow.
Look again at his framing of Stephen. By loudly proclaiming Stephen as the first martyr of his new brand, Paul executes a masterful deflection.
Look over here, not over there.
Yes. It actively draws the historical lens away from the crucifixion of Jesus just months prior. An event Saul was almost certainly involved in orchestrating for the Sanhedrin.
Right.
It minimizes his ultimate guilt. He can admit to being a zealous persecutor who killed a prominent follower, which makes for a dramatic redemption story without having to admit he was the architect of the founder's death.
So if we pull this all together and put it into the language of modern economics, what we're looking at is essentially the most successful hostile corporate takeover in human history.
It is.
Paul comes into a grassroots movement. He takes over the core brand. But to legitimize his new position as the supreme authority, he actively scrubs his own hostile, violent actions from the corporate history books.
It is a hostile takeover that literally altered the course of human civilization. And this economic analysis leads us directly into the incredible fallout of this takeover.
What happened next?
The texts delve deeply into the subsequent relationship between Paul and James, the brother of Jesus.
Because James is still around.
Very much so. James remained in Jerusalem. He was the acknowledged leader of the original localized followers of the Way, and the sources repeatedly note a profound, unspoken hatred and deep friction between Paul and James in the years following Paul's pivot.
Which suddenly makes total pragmatic sense.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if your brother was executed by a monopolistic cartel and the guy who was the chief enforcer for that cartel suddenly shows up, claims he had a vision, and declares himself the new, divinely appointed leader of your movement, yeah, you aren't going to trust him.
Not at all.
There's going to be massive friction.
To put it mildly. But we must understand that the friction wasn't just personal bitterness over the past. It was fundamentally ideological. And at its core, it circled right back to economics.
How so?
Well, James and the original sect of the Nazarenes in Jerusalem fiercely maintained their original teachings. They continued to preach free, direct access to God.
Right.
They maintained their adherence to Jewish law, viewing Jesus as a profound prophet, a man, a rabbi, a light to help them find a pure path.
That original vision.
Yes. But Paul, operating out in the broader Greco-Roman world, was pivoting the theology entirely.
How exactly did he pivot? Like, what was the mechanical difference in what Paul was building?
The sources argue that Paul began sculpting the theology to appeal to a wider, non-Jewish audience. He elevated Jesus from a divinely inspired human rabbi into a literal divine being, the concept of the fullness of the Godhead. He transitioned the narrative from a localized reform movement about direct access into a universal religion centered on the worship of the founder himself.
But mechanically, by doing this, Paul created the need for an entirely new, complex religious architecture.
Exactly.
Right. Because if the theology becomes vastly more complex, you need experts to manage it. You need priests, you need bishops, you need buildings, you need institutions.
Precisely. The new structure Paul envisioned was radically different from the simple, decentralized, free access teachings of the original Nazarenes under James.
It's a completely different model.
It is. Paul built an ideological framework that, over the ensuing centuries, would organically develop its own strict hierarchies, its own mandatory rituals, and eventually its own massive economic engines.
He essentially rebuilt a new version of God, Inc.
He did.
It had a different name, a different theology, and a different location, but it ultimately utilized a similar institutional structure.
The devastating conclusion of the text we are reviewing is that the massive global church architecture that Paul eventually set into motion was fundamentally foreign to the church that the original followers of the way, or Jesus himself, intended. They were polar opposites. One was a localized, decentralized movement teaching free salvation, which threatened to dismantle the empire's financial extraction machine.
Right.
The other evolved into a highly structured, immensely wealthy global religion, authored and engineered by the very man originally hired by the monopoly to destroy it.
That is just staggering.
And he was so successful in his strategic rewriting, his clever cut-and-paste job, that his version of events became the unquestioned, absolute historical truth for 2 millennia.
This analysis fundamentally shifts the ground beneath your feet. I mean, it's brilliant. Let's comprehensively recap this journey we've just taken through the first century.
Yes, let's review.
We started by looking at the macroeconomics of Rome and the microeconomics of the Sanhedrin, realizing they were jointly running a multi-billion-dollar localized monopoly we called God, Inc.
Right.
We saw how the Nazarene message wasn't primarily a debate over scripture, but a catastrophic economic threat. They were preaching free salvation, throwing boulders into the river of money that kept the Roman swords at bay.
And then we explored the legal gridlock, detailing how the Sanhedrin brilliantly and ruthlessly weaponized Rome's lex majestatis, the treason laws.
Yeah.
They utilized the political theater of terror of crucifixion to protect their bank accounts, framing an economic disruptor as a political insurrectionist to keep their own hands ostensibly clean.
From there, we tracked the rise of Saul of Tarsus. We looked past the theology to see his functional role as the Sanhedrin's inquisitor, a highly backed enforcer tasked with cleaning up the remaining financial threat in places like Damascus.
Exactly.
And finally, we unpacked the ultimate hostile takeover. We analyzed the glaring historical omission of Saul from the crucifixion narrative, exploring how his transition to Paul required a strategic rewriting of history.
The cut-and-paste job.
Right. He scrubbed his involvement in the founder's death, deflected focus to Stephen, and pivoted the entire theology away from James's free grace, ultimately becoming the architect of a brand new institutional religion.
If we connect all of this back to you, the listener, the ultimate takeaway isn't about attacking a specific faith.
Not at all.
You might be asking, well, why does the bureaucratic reality of a 2,000-year-old economic dispute matter to my life today?
Why does it?
It matters immensely because it is an exercise in rigorous critical thinking. It forces us to apply a skeptical, analytical lens to the stories and institutions we accept as absolute, unquestionable truth.
Yeah.
It serves as a profound, timeless reminder to always look for the ledger. Look for the economic incentives, the flow of capital, and the preservation of power lurking behind the sanitized historical narratives we are handed.
It's a universal truth.
It teaches us a fundamental, unbreakable rule of human civilization. Whoever controls the flow of the money almost always secures the power to control the flow of the history.
Follow the money and you will inevitably find the history. That is just a brilliant framework to view the world through.
It really changes how you look at everything.
It does. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, something to keep you sharp as you navigate the information in your own life. We've just spent the last hour looking at detailed arguments suggesting that the foundational texts of global history might have been strategically edited and retrofitted by a former enforcer to protect a financial empire and legitimize his own hostile takeover.
Right.
If it is possible that an event of that magnitude was successfully scrubbed and spun.
What else?
Exactly. What other widely accepted, unquestionable historical truths that you learned in a textbook might just be the result of a highly successful ancient public relations campaign hiding in plain sight?
It's a question worth asking.
It absolutely is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the structures around you, keep looking for the hidden ledgers, and above all, keep asking the questions they told you were unquestionable. We'll see you next time.